Okay, so this is a video about how I made a surfboard back in 2006 out of using all Home Depot materials. So I don't know if you can still buy the particular foam that I used to make this, but this is what I did back in Seattle, Washington in 2006. That's the finished product right there. It was an 8-foot surfboard. Buying an 8-foot surfboard, new or even used, was like $600 or $700 back then, and you had to have at least an 8 to 10-foot surfboard to surf the small waves on the western coast of Washington, unless you waited till there were big swells coming in. This was a complete surfboard. By the time I finished epoxying it, you could see that little white dot at the bottom. It had a leash kit that I epoxied into it, and then in this next frame here, with it over on its side, you could see I put a fin kit on it also, and I glued all that in there, and I basically used this weird yellow foam that I got from Home Depot to make the surfboard. I used epoxy and then that blue dye, and I bought the components separate for like $20 or $30, but that's kind of a beginning of how I made it. So I was talking about that yellow foam that I got from Home Depot in 2006. This yellow foam, it was softer than the more rigid blue or pink stuff that you could get, but it was still used for home insulation. And it had a it had a aluminum foil on one side of it, so I had to peel that off, and I had to use it once again because the epoxy would eat up the other stuff, but the epoxy had no effect on this. It would just seal and glue all this stuff together. So I sandwiched those layers together, and that's a stringer that I cut out of cedar, I think. And I cut the whole after I sandwiched everything together. I cut those the boards in half and basically glued the stringer in there and drilled holes for those little pegs to keep everything rigid and glued together. It really wasn't that hard to do. It's pretty basic. And that's just another picture of the format that I glued those in to get an angle on the front of it. What I really liked about building the surfboard, it was all soft materials. So, I mean, I had hand tools, but it wasn't like I was cutting through a thick board to do this. It was like, I glued the foam together, um, cut the whole board thing in half, and then glued the stringer in there, drilled the little holes, and then stuck the pegs in there to make everything glue together and coated everything in glue before I glued it together. It was just really simple. After I got everything glued together, that's me cutting out the basic shape of the board. That was simple. Really, I tried to make things symmetrical by measuring on both sides of it, and it wasn't exactly perfect, but I wasn't a perfect surfer, so I didn't really care at the time. Yeah, there's not much I really cared that much about the symmetry back then. I was just rushing to get it done. This is just another shot of this is right before I glued it. I had the stringer in there, just was placing everything together. It wasn't a perfectly straight line, but I didn't really care. I figured it'd come out okay once I got everything glued. That's me with my mask to make sure I didn't breathe in too much of that epoxy stuff. I don't know if it actually worked. This is me clamping everything together when I had everything epoxied, and I bought those type of cheap pipe clamps, and I don't know if I left those in Seattle, but I just used a scrap piece of lumber to get all that um, held together overnight. It's pretty simple. Yeah, the clamping and the gluing was really straightforward. Epoxy dried pretty fast or cured pretty fast. I was happy with it, man. When that thing was rigid and I was able to sand it the next morning, I was really happy. I was like, man, this should be pretty easy for a novice carpenter for myself at the time to do. Simple. Okay, so that's just another shot of how I sanded the board. I think that was actually a different surfboard that I messed up on, or the first piece of foam, but it's just showing how I cut out the symmetry. That was a different board. So about this, like I keep saying epoxy, it was actually it was fiberglass, resin, whatever you want to call it, epoxy, and I used the cloth. And I wrapped the whole board with the cloth, and then I put the resin epoxy over it. And then after I did a thin layer on the top, decided to mix in some of that blue dye into the epoxy or into the resin as I was doing it, and that's kind of how I did it. That's another shot. You can see that white dot at the back. That's where I put the leash plug in there. That's just another component that you epoxy in there. And then when I put the cloth in, I just made sure that the cloth had a went over that, and then I cut it out after I finished epoxying it. But yeah, that's just basically the first lay-in of the cloth, the fiberglass cloth or whatever you call it, and then putting the layer of resin over that, and then mixing the dye. Both sides epoxied. I only had the clear coat on the bottom, and it just looked badass. You can see that blue strip in the middle of the stringer, at the kind of towards the back of the board. That's where I put my fin insert in there. It was basically an insert where you could put it was basically a plastic piece of plastic that had a slit in it, and you slit the fin into it. And that's a picture of how the black fin went into the back of the board. But that first picture that I was just at, I just loved the way it looked. It was just, everything was taking shape, and I really wish that I hadn't have done the dye on the bottom of the board, because I liked how the contours looked. Maybe I was just trying to hide the steps on the epoxied layers on the front. There's just one more shot of the bottom of the board, just how I liked it with the place where I put the fin. I glued that insert in there with epoxy. Everything came out perfect. That was such a fun little project, and it actually did pretty good in those little 4 to 6 foot waves. That's the board pretty much all finished, or at least the front of it. It came out pretty good. I was really surprised, but I put enough work into it, and I was young and good with my hands at the time, and it was fun. There's a side view of it. It actually performed really well. It was kind of ugly. The guy I sold it to was like, this doesn't even look like a real... Oh, that's the old surfboard I bought for 90 bucks that had a shark bite, what it looked like out of the side of it, and then a broken fin in the middle. I used that for when my friends came surfing with me. That's just another side view shot of the surfboard, finished product, and that's the corniest picture ever. Actually, no, I have plenty of bad pictures. That's me and my two friends at the time. That's another picture of the board with wax on it, so that I didn't come flying off the board when I was trying to catch waves. But man, that thing was fun. And that's just another picture of the finished product, man, with the fin. It was awesome. Yeah, build your own thing if you can.